The Belle Mead Mansion in Nashville, Tennessee, is known for its historical significance and eerie reputation. It is a grand, historic estate built in the 1800s and has attracted numerous fans of the paranormal due to its rumored haunting. One of the most famous stories associated with the mansion is the ghost of a woman in white, a common spectral figure often tied to tragic or untold stories of the past. Visitors and paranormal investigators have reported strange occurrences, such as unexplained cold spots, flickering lights, and shadowy figures. The mansion's dark history, including its use as a plantation and later as a private residence, has contributed to its reputation as a hotspot for ghostly activity. As night fell over the Belle Mead Mansion, the air grew thick with the tension of untold stories. The once grand estate stood silent, its stone walls whispering secrets of the past. On the edge of the property, a figure in a flowing white gown was said to appear, walking slowly across the lawn, her eyes hollow and her face hidden in the veil of darkness. Some believed her to be the spirit of a former mistress of the house, whose tragic fate was sealed on a stormy night long ago. Local legend told that the woman had been engaged to the mansion's wealthy owner, but on the eve of their wedding, she had vanished without a trace. The guests waiting for her arrival had heard nothing but the thunderstorm raging outside, the howling winds mixing with whispers of something darker at play. Despite search parties and rumors of her being seen walking through the halls, she was never found again. As the years passed, strange things began to occur in the mansion. Visitors reported hearing faint footsteps echoing through the grand hallways, only to turn and find nothing but the dusty, dim-lit rooms. The sound of a woman crying could be heard late at night, followed by the soft rustling of fabric like the swoosh of a dress gliding across the floor. But the most chilling phenomenon occurred during stormy nights, when the mansion's lights flickered erratically and the shadowy figure of the woman in white could be seen standing in the upstairs window. One particular evening, a group of paranormal investigators, determined to uncover the truth, arrived at the mansion after dark. Armed with cameras, EVP recorders, and other equipment, they were ready to document any unusual activity. They set up their base camp in the grand parlor, a room where many claimed to have felt an overwhelming presence of dread. As the night wore on, strange sounds reverberated through the house. First, the faint tapping of something against the walls, then the unmistakable creak of footsteps approaching from the upstairs. One investigator, Megan, dared to ascend the staircase, the hairs on her neck prickling with every step she took. As she reached the landing, a cold breeze swept through her, though the windows were tightly shut. Her flashlight flickered, illuminating the dark corridor ahead. That's when she saw it standing at the far end of the hall, the figure of the woman in white. Megan's breath caught in her throat as the spirit turned slowly, the moonlight casting a ghostly glow on her pale, ethereal face. Her eyes were empty, filled with sorrow and longing, but also with an unspoken warning. The investigator froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as the ghostly figure began to move toward her with slow, deliberate steps. The closer the apparition came, the colder the air grew, until it felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. With one final step, the figure was mere inches from Megan. The woman in white reached out, her icy hand brushing the investigator's cheek. A voice, soft and distant, echoed in Megan's mind, a whisper so faint it was almost drowned out by the wind. But before she could make sense of the words, the figure was gone, fading into the darkness like smoke. Megan stumbled back in shock, her body trembling. The other investigators rushed to her side, and as they did, the lights in the room flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in absolute darkness. What happened next was something no one could have prepared for. In the pitch-black silence, the group of investigators stood frozen, unable to see each other, their breath shallow and quick in the stifling air. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder as the storm outside raged on, seemingly intensifying by the second. Then, from the corner of the room, a soft whisper echoed, so quiet that it was barely audible over the storm. "Leave," the voice was faint, as though coming from a great distance, but unmistakable. Megan, still trembling from her encounter, strained her ears to listen. Was it the woman in white? Or was it something else, something far older, more malevolent? Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered back to life, casting a ghostly glow across the room. But what they saw caused their blood to run cold. The parlor, once empty, was now filled with strange, shadowy figures, some tall, others hunched, all draped in the same eerie mist that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes, and the temperature continued to drop, until they could see their breath fogging in front of them. "Did anyone else see that?" whispered Mark, one of the investigators, his voice barely above a breath. They all nodded, eyes wide with fear, but no one dared to speak. The shadows in the room seemed to sway, as though alive, moving just outside their vision. And then, there it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the staircase. This time they were louder, more insistent. Each step seemed to echo through the hall, closer and closer, until the footsteps reached the parlor door. The door creaked open on its own, and standing in the doorway, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the windows, was the woman in white. Her gown seemed to shimmer with a spectral glow, the faintest hint of something dark, moving beneath the fabric. Her face, still hidden behind her veil, was now closer than ever. The chilling cold emanated from her presence, and as she stepped into the room, her feet never quite seemed to touch the ground. The shadows around her writhed and shifted like living things, as though the mansion itself was reacting to her return. Megan, her heart racing, stepped forward, almost against her will. It was as if the woman in white was calling to her, drawing her in with an invisible pull. The others grabbed hold of her, trying to pull her back, but she resisted, her feet moving of their own accord. She didn't understand why, but she felt as though she had to get closer to the figure, had to see what it was trying to tell her. The woman in white tilted her head slightly, as though noticing the group's hesitance. And then, with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, she spoke. "Why do you disturb me?" Her voice was like a distant, mournful breeze, carrying the weight of centuries. Megan felt her chest tighten as the words sank in, but she couldn't form a reply. Instead, another voice rang out, this time from behind the woman in white. It was low, guttural, and filled with an unmistakable malice. "You should have never come here." The air grew heavier, the shadows darker. It was then that they realized they weren't alone. A chill ran down Megan's spine as something cold, something far more dangerous, began to stir in the mansion's depths. And it was watching them. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as if the very mansion itself was alive and angry. The whisper of the woman in white faded into the eerie silence, replaced by the low, rumbling growl of the unseen voice. It was as if something had awoken in the depths of the mansion, something ancient, something vengeful. Mark's hand shot out, grabbing Megan's arm, trying to pull her back toward the door. But she felt an overwhelming force, a compulsion, pushing her forward, toward the figure in the doorway. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body wouldn't obey. The woman in white stepped closer, her presence so overpowering that it felt as though the room itself was being drained of warmth, of light. The shadows swirled around her like a cloak, and as she moved, the figures in the dark seemed to shift and writhe in tandem. It was as though the spirits of the mansion had come alive, gathering in the corners, watching, waiting. "You do not belong here," the voice echoed again, sharper now, and with it, a tremor ran through the floorboards. The ground seemed to shudder beneath their feet, and the lights above flickered violently. The mansion groaned, as if protesting their presence, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness again. When the lights flickered back to life, the woman in white was gone. But the air was thick with the presence of something malevolent, something far worse than the sorrowful ghost they had first encountered. The investigators stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their minds racing. Mark took a step forward, glancing nervously at the others. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice hoarse. But before they could turn to leave, The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound reverberated through the mansion, causing the very floor to tremble beneath their feet. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if something was closing in on them from all sides. "Help us, leave," the voice of the woman in white whispered again. But this time, it was accompanied by the sounds of chains rattling heavy, iron chains followed by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. Suddenly, one of the investigators, Jacob, turned to face the others, his eyes wide with terror. "Look, there's something in the hallway." The others spun around, following his gaze. At first, they saw nothing but the dark, empty corridor stretching into the depths of the mansion. But then, a figure began to take shape, materializing in the shadows. It was a tall, imposing figure, cloaked in darkness, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. It moved toward them, its form shifting like smoke, and in its wake, the temperature dropped even further. The floor beneath their feet began to crack and splinter, the sound of ancient wood splintering echoing in the silence. Mark's voice cracked as he grabbed Megan's arm. "We need to run now." But as they turned toward the door, something strange happened. The room around them seemed to warp, twisting and shifting, as though the very structure of the mansion was bending to the will of the unseen force that now controlled it. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thick, suffocating, as though the house was trying to trap them in its embrace. The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, coalescing into shapes too horrifying to fully comprehend. Some were fleeting hazy figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Others were solid, their features grotesque, with hollow eyes and mouths that stretched unnaturally wide in silent screams. As the group struggled to make sense of what was happening, a low, thunderous voice roared through the mansion, shaking the very foundations of the building. "You should not have come. The house is hungry." The shadows lunged, the figures converging on the investigators, surrounding them. The temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath turned to mist, and the room seemed to stretch into infinity. Then, without warning, everything went silent. The house held its breath, and in that silence, the investigators realized they weren't alone. The mansion had never been abandoned. It had always been waiting. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the echo of their ragged breaths and the distant rumble of the storm outside. The air was thick with something oppressive, something ancient and hungry, as if the very walls of the Belle Mead Mansion were alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Megan's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting around the room as the shadows seemed to shift and swirl like living creatures. She reached for Mark's arm, her grip tight, but before she could speak, a cold, hollow voice echoed through the room once again. "You have awakened what should remain asleep." The voice seemed to come from all directions, reverberating in their skulls, making their heads ache as though something was trying to claw its way into their minds. It was not the woman in white's voice this time, but something darker, something more malicious, a presence that felt older than the house itself. Jacob stumbled backward, his face pale and stricken with terror. What does it want with us?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the mansion itself was alive, its heartbeat echoing through the very bones of the building. The light above flickered erratically, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. A sudden, sharp cry echoed from the depths of the mansion, something not human, something unnatural. It was the sound of something trapped, desperate, and filled with pain. The group turned toward the hallway, their eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing to see but the thickening darkness. "We need to find a way out," Mark said urgently, his voice strained with panic. But as he moved toward the door again, something strange happened. The handle twisted on its own, rattling violently as if something on the other side was trying to break through. The door groaned, and the faintest whispers filtered through the cracks, so faint that it was almost imperceptible. Stay with me." It was the woman in white again. Her voice was quieter now, almost pleading, but there was something different about it. something more desperate. The investigators exchanged glances, unsure whether to trust the voice or to run for their lives. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the temperature plummeted, sending waves of ice-cold air sweeping through the room. In the doorway stood the woman in white, but this time her veil was lifted, revealing her face. It was pale, drawn, and gaunt, with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to pierce into their very souls. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice strained with anguish. "I tried to warn you." Before anyone could respond, the shadows around her seemed to surge forward, surrounding her like a cloak, and the entire room seemed to tremble with the force of their movement. The shadows were not just specters now, they were alive, filling the room with an insidious presence that made it feel as though the very air was choking them. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she felt the icy grip of the shadows pulling at her, trying to drag her into the depths of the room. The other investigators tried to grab hold of her, but it was as if their hands were passing through thin air, the shadows dissipating like smoke before their fingers could touch them. The woman in white stepped forward, her face twisted in an expression of sorrow and something far darker. "You must leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "You've awakened the house, and it won't let you go." As she spoke, the room seemed to warp once again. The walls closed in, the floor beneath them cracked and buckled, and the once grand mansion began to twist, as though the building itself was being consumed by the very shadows that haunted it. The group was pulled into the center of the room, their bodies jerking uncontrollably, as if being dragged by invisible forces. A low growl rumbled from the heart of the mansion, growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. The shadows swarmed like a living tide, and Megan's vision began to blur as she struggled against the unseen pull. The woman in white's voice echoed in her mind, repeating the same words over and over. "Leave, leave, leave," but they could not move. They were trapped. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the shadows stopped. The growl ceased. The room fell into an eerie stillness. The woman in white was gone, and with her, the oppressive presence that had consumed the mansion. The air felt thick with uncertainty as they slowly regained control of their bodies, their senses reeling from the surreal nightmare they had just endured. But as the group gathered their bearings, something else became clear. There was a new presence in the room. Something darker, something far more dangerous. And it was watching them. As the oppressive silence hung in the room, the investigators exchanged nervous glances. Their bodies still trembled, hearts racing, but the air felt oddly still now. The shadows, though still present in the corners of the room, no longer swirled with the same malevolent energy. Yet there was something else, something worse, that lingered, unseen but undeniably real. Megan was the first to break the silence. "We need to go. Now." But as she moved toward the door, something stopped her, a faint tug on her sleeve, as though someone or something was holding her back. She spun around, but no one was there. The others had not moved, but their eyes were wide with fear. They too could feel it, the cold, invisible weight pressing down on them. "Did you feel that?" Jacob whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the air seemed to hum with a dark energy, and then the voice returned, but this time it was louder, clearer, and more terrifying than ever before. "You are mine." The words reverberated through the room, vibrating in their bones, as if the house itself was speaking, its voice coming from the very walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. The lights flickered once more, casting the room in an erratic, ghostly glow. The shadows around them shifted and coiled, as though something was stirring deep within the house, awakening. Mark stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "We have to leave or we're never leaving." He reached for the door, but it slammed shut with a force so violent that the entire room shook. The group was thrown backward, crashing into the walls as the mansion seemed to constrict around them. The windows rattled violently, as though something beyond the glass was pressing against them, trying to break through. Then, through the deafening roar of the storm outside and the chaotic noises of the house, they heard it, a loud, bone-chilling shriek. It sounded human, but twisted, as though it was coming from a place far deeper, darker than any living thing could originate. "Run!" Mark screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the growing cacophony of growls and whispers filling the mansion. And that's when they saw it. At the end of the hallway, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. Taller than a man, its shape was impossibly twisted, a grotesque distortion of limbs and darkness. Its eyes were glowing red, and its mouth was a gaping maw of endless teeth, the size of which no human could possess. The shadows seemed to pool around it, alive and swirling like a storm of nightmares. The house seemed to tremble with its presence. The investigators turned and bolted for the door, desperation fueling their every movement. But as they reached the threshold, the temperature dropped again, colder than it had ever been. They were frozen in place, unable to move, as the figure slowly advanced toward them, the shadows whispering in an unintelligible language. The woman in white's voice returned, this time louder than before, her words echoing in their minds. "Leave before it's too late." But there was no escape. The shadows converged on the group, pulling them into the depths of the mansion. They screamed as they fought against the darkness, but it was futile. The mansion's grip was unrelenting. It was as though the house had become one with the spirits of the damned, a living, breathing entity that had fed on the souls of countless victims over the years. The last thing they heard before the darkness overtook them was a single, final whisper. "Welcome home." And then, there was nothing. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.